G'day, Professor Joseph Drew here. I'm here to talk to you about an absolutely critical topic, which is the inflation outlook for Australia. This is so important. It's important in your personal budgets, but of course it's incredibly important into your local government budget, to local government financial sustainability. So please hang on. So the latest CPI figures 5.1%. I predicted several months ago that would have a 5 in front of it. I was correct. The PPI figure surprised me, 4.9. I expected it to be higher than CPI. So yes, I'm fallible like everyone. But you know what? This data is ancient history. It refers to the first 3 months of this year, January, February, March. They've been and gone. Inflation is moving so quickly that to get this figure close to the end of April is pretty darn useless. We'll find that the March movements were much higher than January movements, and we'll find that things picked up considerably in April. You only got to do your own shopping or fill up your car to know that that is the case. Now, the problem is if you don't predict inflation for the coming year correctly, you're going to be unwittingly providing your residents with a real discount on their taxes and their fees. Now, some local governments might be able to afford to do it, but most of you, if you go backwards in real terms in your revenue, you're going to be in an extremely difficult financial fiscal plight, and some councils just won't survive it. So we must get this right. Okay, so what can we expect from here? Now, I will say at this point, I predicted this precise situation back in April 2020. I've got written evidence that I can show where I wrote to the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister telling them this would be the outcome of reckless fiscal and monetary policy. I predicted the 5 handle on our inflation several months ago. I have got a good track record because I've got a good knowledge of economic theory, and I'm not biased by political considerations. I don't care what side of politics is talking. All I care about are councils and the residents that rely on them and making sure that we get you through in one piece. Now, there is downward pressure, potential downward pressure on inflation coming, but there's also an awful lot of potential upward pressure on inflation. Let me go through some of these. So reasons why inflation might go down. Things like base effects. Every quarter we move up a quarter from the base that we compare it to. Arithmetically, that means it's harder to grow at a higher rate. So that works in our favour, the fact that we're moving forward in time. It doesn't mean inflation's going to drop, but it means that the pace of the growth should slow down. Most stimulus is nearing an end, although our federal government, in order to get re-elected, decided to hand out more free money. The precise thing that got us in this mess in the first place. But most governments around the world are getting sensible and stopped handing out free money. We've overcompensated for COVID. That's why we're in this mess. Some central banks are starting to act prudently. The American Central Bank, the Kiwi Central Bank. We're not acting prudently, unfortunately. But because we now live in a global economy and cash can slosh around the world so quickly, the fact that the Americans are doing the right thing actually helps us. It would be better if we were doing the sensible thing as well. So that's reasons why we can expect some downward pressure on inflation, but there's lots more reasons to expect upward pressure on inflation, which is why my thesis is that we haven't peaked and that when we do peak, it will be sticky, and we're looking at 3 years of this, at least. So upwards pressure. Central banks are in a tough spot. If they move interest rates up 0.5%, that'll add to about $100 a month to most people's mortgage repayments. Now, in order to tame inflation, we need the cash rate to get above the inflation rate. We can't lift the cash rate to 5%. Well, we can lift it to 5.1%, but it's absolutely going to crush households, and it's going to pop that ginormous property bubble that we've gone to such dire lengths to blow up over the last 2 decades. And then we really are going to see what a disaster is all about. So they're in a tough spot. If they try too aggressively to tame inflation, if they do what our normal tool is, they're actually going to pull the economy down. And a lot of mortgagees simply won't be able to cope with the types of interest rates that we need to control inflation. I can remember when I first joined the bank in 1990, home loan rates 18%. We've got a whole generation, for 11 years, interest rates been going down, of people with mortgages that don't understand that rates go up sometimes. It's really going to hurt. And I think push comes to shove, the central bank won't have the courage to do what's required to tame inflation. Central bank credibility. It wasn't that long ago they were telling me that inflation was transitory. Of course it wasn't. It's never going to be transitory. Anyone that's read Friedman or economics knew that. Then they were going to tell us that we're definitely not going to have any interest rate increases till 2024. Well, now they're admitting they're going to have it this month or next month. It's hard to believe anything that's coming out of them. So when they now are saying that, oh, we predict inflation will go back to the band of 2 to 3% next year, I'm not quite sure why anyone's believing them, because they've been out and out wrong so far. The low dollar actually will have an inflationary impact on us. It depends where we're importing from. Also, the huge PPIs overseas, producer price indexes. I've got a video on this. 30% in Europe, 10% in the US. That's all having an upward inflationary effect. We're now seeing inflation get embedded in wages. You know that because the nurses will on strike this week, the teachers will on strike next week, and so are the EMBOs. So we're seeing people go for bigger wage increases and take industrial action when they don't get them. Now, think about it. If you're the union representing local government workers and you've got an EBA to negotiate this year, like they do in New South Wales, you can't ask for less than 5.1%. Because if you are, you're saying our members deserve a real pay cut. That's not going to wash. They won't have any members. So it's going to get embedded. And then what happens is, because the companies or the businesses need to pay higher wages, they need to cover those higher wages. They put up prices. As new inventory comes from overseas, they'll have to put up prices because they're paying more for this new inventory. There's so much upward pressure coming. The war's not over. It may yet spread. It's quite likely to spread. Now Russia's realised they can turn off gas taps, and that's having reverberations through in terms of higher gas and fuel prices, and it will even affect coal prices eventually. We've still got the supply shocks. They haven't gone anywhere. In fact, they've got worse. Apple tells us that in their latest reports, that they're expecting to take up to a $4 billion hit because of supply shocks. We know, ports in China are being closed down because of their COVID response. We've still got those supply shocks. We're still being told chips won't be getting fixed this year. None of it's going away. The energy transition that people are so keen on costs money, and it will continue to cost money. And what's worse is, because we've been talking about going green all these years, people haven't been investing in oil and gas, certainly not in oil and coal, and as a result we don't have enough of it, and that's going to drive costs up. We've got company margins have been squeezed, but there's a limit to how long they will be squeezed before their shareholders revolt, and they'll have to pass on the cost. And we're seeing more and more companies pass on the cost. If you've done your shopping recently, you know that companies are being forced to pass on their higher costs. It's not just in energy, it's in food stuff. We've lost up to 35% of our wheat production, a lot of our corn production. And this had impacts also on animals because they feed based on grains. It's feeding into just about every aspect of our lives. It's not just about energy. It's a food crisis as well, which we'll discover in the next 6 to 12 months as crops aren't harvested because they weren't planted because people were in the middle of a war. So those costs are going to have to be passed on, and they will feed all the way through the economy. And you know what another problem is? Normally inflation is a demand side problem. You want to temper demand. But so much of this inflation, some of it's demand, because we lock people up in houses for a year and now they want to go out and buy. We can temper that side of it. But so much of this inflation is caused by supply shocks, side shocks, and moving rates isn't going to do anything about that anyway. So for all those reasons, I think there's far more reason to think of upward pressure. I think there's far more reason to think that we're nowhere near peaking. And as I said, with those EBAs and things, they're sticky. They hang around for 3 years. It's a good thing for us on the way up. It's helped us. On the way down, it'll mean that inflation hangs around longer for Australia. So I expect this to persist at least 3 years. And you've only got to look at how historical events have played out. Look at the barber boom. Look up Milton Friedman's commentary on what happened during the 70s. Look at what happened in Zimbabwe. and then look at what's happened abroad, which is what I'll talk about in the next slide. So, as I say, I think the upward pressure on inflation is still much higher than the downward pressure on inflation. What's happened abroad, that gives us some ideas too. Look at New Zealand, inflation 6.9%. They had all the lockdowns and all the crazy things that we did. Okay, the difference is their central bank was much more prudent than ours. They've already increased the official cash rate to 1.5%. They stopped buying bonds back in July 2021. Now compare that to Australia. Inflation of 5.1%, official interest rate still at historical lows, 0.1%. Absolutely insane and ridiculous, and we're all going to suffer because of their inaction and their concern about being seen as political during an election campaign. And they only got around to ending the bond program in February of this year. They were still pumping more liquidity into the system, increasing money supply. So we've done all the wrong things, and we also did all the COVID things that the Kiwis did. Why do you expect a different outcome? And I don't think the Kiwis have peaked at 6.9%. Nowhere near it. We're behind the Kiwis because we were behind them opening up because of the different levels in inventories at the time. But we will catch up. The same things that are happening overseas will ultimately happen here, particularly because we're so import dependent. So my thesis is that we haven't come close to peaking in inflation. My thesis is that we can expect inflation to stick around for 3 years. My thesis is that when unions start negotiating EBAs for council workers, that they're going to be asking at the very least for the current rate of inflation, 5.1%, which means that you need to factor in 5.1% growth to your wage bills for the next 3 years from when the next EBA starts. Now, all of this means that local governments are in the most diabolical situation of a generation because the rate caps haven't been keeping up with it, and councils where they're not capped, Queensland, South Australia and the like, I don't think people have been aware of how fast this inflation is growing, how sticky it is, and what a problem it is. Now, in your defence, you've probably been listening to the talk from the RBA and from politicians who have got a political agenda, and you're believing them. I don't know why you're still believing them when they've been wrong so many times. But if you continue to believe them and you don't factor in what's almost certain to happen, you're going to come to a screaming, shuddering halt, and it's going to be a terrible experience for you and your community. So please don't. Think carefully about it. Think about whether you think the upward pressures are stronger than the downward pressure. Read about Barbara Boom, read about Zimbabwe, read some Milton Friedman, and tell me about whether you think it's going to be sticky or not. Think about how EBAs work. They work not just on the upside, which the RBA is very happy about, they work on the way down too. They're going to hold things up longer. So this is what you need to do. You need to adjust your fees and charges according to what your thesis is about inflation for the coming financial year. If you think it's going higher and it's going to stick around for that whole 12 months, and I certainly think both of those things, well then you need to incorporate that into your fees and charges and increase them sufficiently to cover those extra costs. Now there is a video on the difference between CPI and PPI and why one is more important than the other, depending whether you're a council person or if you're a resident. Please watch it and understand that and ask me questions if you haven't. Now, you also need to adjust your rates according to this inflation prediction. Now that's hard if you're in a rate capping environment. Most of the country isn't, thank goodness. Those of you who are in a rate capping environment in Victoria and New South Wales, if you obviously can't put up your rates, you've got 0.7 or 1.5% when inflation is 5.1%. So in real terms, you're going backwards by about 3.5% in revenue, which is just not doable for most councils. Well, what that means is that you're going to have to put in for a special rate variation this year or the year after. It's as simple as that. Everyone needs to be reviewing their financial sustainability. If you're not in a rate capping environment, put your rates up by something sensible. Okay? Don't go putting them up by 0.7% because that's just not going to work, is it? Either way, this is the time to review financial sustainability, because if I'm right, this problem is not going away for at least 3 years. Maybe you can take a hit 1 year. I bet you can't take it 2, and I guarantee you can't take it 3. So review your financial sustainability, review these other videos and start doing some of those things. And let's all hope that we get those really important changes to local government done this year. The rate capping systems need to be overhauled so that they're fit for purpose to work in a high inflation environment. We need to overhaul the FAGs so it actually works according to the intent of the legislation, not being such a lucky dip scenario like we have at present. We need to also dispel fiscal illusion and address that fiscal illusion problem. I've got videos on all these things. Look, guys, I hope this has been helpful to you. I'm sorry I can't be more positive. I think this is the biggest challenge of the generation. Please watch this video, send it around to other people, get them talking and thinking about this. You know, operational plans are coming out in the next couple of weeks, and if your plans aren't reflecting this, if your plans are reflecting politically inspired rhetoric, you're going to have a real mess on your hands next financial years. Look, all I want to do is help. If you think this can help, if you want to use it in your staff training, if you want to use it, give it to other councillors, other council staff, you want to put it up on your council website, I don't care what you do with it. You ever use a whole lot, little bits of it, I really don't care. All we want to do is help people. Help me to help others and spread the word. Thank you very much for your time. Goodbye.